Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
Hello, and welcome to Courageous Conversations. I'm Dr. Peter Weinstein, and I'm here with
Dr. Phil Nelson, and welcome to Courageous Conversations.
We are here with the great thanks to Nationwide for their support, and with great thanks to Nicole for her support. Continuing our discussions on veterinary, social, and world issues. And we're going to kind of step into the world of veterinary medicine a little bit, but it's got a global impact, and it really goes back to even why we started these Courageous Conversations. And some of it is a discussion of DEI. Both Phil and I are contributing to a publication coming up that will be focused on DEI within the profession. And we started talking about it. I said this would be great to talk about it further. Phil, what is your foundation for your article or viewpoint, or what is it that you're focusing on in your contribution?
Well, I guess my focus is going to be on the backlash that we're seeing to diversity efforts, particularly in higher education or in education in general. And in my article, I'm going to take a critical look at what may have caused that backlash. And I think it forced me, after reading articles from 2020 on till now, it's forced me to reevaluate the tactics that we have been using to promote diversity. And I hope that in our discussion, we're able to parse the responses and the things that we may have ignored while we were trying to address the insults that caused this work in diversity. I think we've lost our vision of the prize. And the prize is for civilization to get along. You know, essentially that is our ultimate goal. And we have devolved and begun to focus on words without understanding the impact of our actions on our own emotions. What about you? What is the purpose? What is the basis of your article? What are you addressing?
I'm addressing the lack of diversity in the specialty aspects of veterinary medicine. And it's just an extension of some of the lack of diversity in the basic population of veterinarians that we are seeing, and we have a trickle-down shortage in terms of the specialists. And as we are starting to see changes in the American population, where I think it was 2035, the minority will be the majority, we need to start to have specialists who look like the population that will be bringing their pets to them. So it really addresses the fact that we have to identify ways to encourage all people to look at becoming specialists, because we actually are seeing a decrease in the number of veterinary students interested in going into postgraduate education. But more on top of that, we have to look at increase the people of color and others in becoming specialists from that standpoint. And it just reflects on the global efforts within the veterinary profession to diversify. And it overlays what you're saying, which is, you know, we've known about this issue for 30 some odd years, Phil. You've written about it when you had dark hair. Now you're writing again about it now that you have gray hair. Well, I didn't write about it when I had dark hair, but I became much more aware of it now that I have gray hair. But I can show you articles, and we've shared articles that go back 20, 25, 30 years that indicate there was an awareness in this profession of the lack of diversity. And we were aware, maybe we weren't aware, but we saw a change about just over 30 years ago, when we went from 50% men and women to an even greater percentage of women in the profession. And we recognize that, we talked about that, but at no point in time did we really bring the lack of diversity to the same headlines that we saw as we were starting to see more and more women in the field. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, this is nothing new.
No, there's not. It definitely is nothing new. But again, we're talking about diversity as if it's a separate entity in and of itself. And that's what bothers me sometimes when we start talking about this. And it is that type of discussion that leads one to wonder, is this, is this a problem first? And is this now the remedies that we're offering or seeking actually needed? There are generational issues here within this discussion because of the difference in experiences of the differing generations. And I find that, and I'm beginning to observe, or at least my observation is that our discussion has been void of social factors. When we have a camp that can actually say with a straight face that diversity was a engineered profession in order to make money, and that's the only reason it's important, that is akin to saying the Holocaust never happened. Okay. And when I make that statement, I'm also aware that I am tempting fate even further by focusing on a major incident, whether it is slavery or slavery in the United States or the Holocaust. And what is missing in this is that what all we really want is to what we're failing to recognize is that we are descendants of an imperfect world, and we're dealing with problems that were caused by our ancestors, and that those problems did not just occur in 1776. Those problems were in place before Plymouth Rock. They were in place in the European countries that settled this country, that took this country. But that's the westernized version. We have similar problems in the East. We're all on this great big blue pearl, hurtling through space, wondering how we're going to survive as a race, as a human race. And yet we're fighting over whether or not diversity is important. Well, I've got news for you. Diversity is natural. We all get worried. We happen to be veterinarians, and we're all worried about the loss of certain species because of our actions on the globe, because we recognize what happens when genetic diversity becomes less and less. And so fighting diversity is fighting against nature. But this is a tool, it's a tactic. And we complicated it by adding equity and inclusion and anti-racism to the name. So pick your poison. Which one do you want to fight? You can fight the whole thing just by being adamant about one part of it. When in essence, it's Rodney King probably summed it up the best. Can't we get along?
And that's exactly correct. It shouldn't be a battle. I mean, it should be a discussion. It should be an education. It should be a process. It shouldn't be what you're interesting at the beginning of your monologue. You were talking about the camp that thought diversity, equity, inclusion was created as a for-profit organization, and the fact that there's this belief that it was created for the business components of it, not for the social economic components of it from that standpoint. Diversity, as you noted, it's part of just growing to learn to live with other people, to work with other people who are different than you in their religious beliefs, in their color, in their background. And it's this country, especially the melting pot that it is really should learn how to work with others. And we really shouldn't be building walls and barriers. And we should be having these conversations, and we should be having people who want to be a part of the conversation. I don't think that DEI was created as a business entity. I think it was brought to the fore as an opportunity to discuss differences. And again, you and I have had these courageous conversations for a while. It was part of a courageous conversation to address issues and differences and learn about others and how we can all be one big happy world. God, wouldn't it be nice to be one big happy world instead of castes or sects or other groupings? Why can't we all get along? I mean, quote Rodney King, quote Jesus, quote Gandhi, quote whomever you want. But why can't we just all get along? Why can't we learn to work collaboratively towards a common good, no matter what the color of your skin is or what your beliefs are from a sexual or religious standpoint? But we create barriers instead of shaking hands.
And I think part of the problem is that the response to the insults, whichever, we act as if the insults started with American slavery. We also act as if the insult may have started with European colonialism of America. Where when the land was taken from Native Americans. But then Native Americans participated in slavery too. And yet what we have failed to recognize is that as a society, we are made up of people who are descendants of the slaves and the slave owners. And if the slave owner descendants want to say, I didn't do that, don't make me pay for that problem, at least recognize the problem. If slave owners want to say that I'm not responsible, if descendants of slave owners want to say that I didn't pass those laws that resulted in redlining during the Jim Crow era and other restrictive policies and laws that we have to change, at least let's recognize the impact of it in an effort to have an open democracy that provides for equality across the way. Now, this is when you can have a cogent, rational discussion about affirmative action and whether it's the proper way to correct past behaviors or not. But descendants of slaves also have to understand that they are a part of this same society that has the same challenge, and both groups have to work together if we're going to try to achieve a more equitable and palatable outcome, societal outcome. And that means that maybe we shouldn't be guilting the descendants of slave owners so much, other than to recognize here's where we are. And when you made the comment that because of the demographic changes in our population, there should be a concomitant demographic change in the people who deliver veterinary services for that population. I submit that may be racist in and of itself.
It's a good point. I mean, I think I'm sensitive to it because I've had these conversations with you. I've had these conversations with other people, and maybe I'm more knowledgeable from all the different things that I've read within the field. I think it's important, however, that we, speaking more so within the veterinary profession, that we look at it, that we learn about it, and we see where we can work collaboratively to meet the needs of the consumers and meet the needs of our profession, and whether that is a change in who we elect or select to become veterinary students, become veterinarians, become specialists. I think it'll play out over time. But I do think that having these conversations and bringing the information to the fore is the most important thing that we can be doing. And I think there's been some efforts at many different levels within the profession just in the last 5 years to.
Well, I agree. And don't get me wrong, I would prefer to see a profession that reflects the population demographically. However, I also am, but I am more concerned that the members of the profession understand the needs of those demographics and can meet those needs out of their awareness of those differences. And though I recognize that we're not there, that there are historical influences that has resulted in the demographic appearance of our profession, right now. What I want is equitable access. I want equitable training for all demographics. But you can't control for everything. And you've heard me say this before. And in some cases, we can legislate behavior, but we can't legislate hearts. We can legislate hearts, but we can educate minds. We can educate, not, well, I've lost the word I was trying to say. I was thinking, not indoctrinate behavior.
I support the education component, and I think that's part of why we're having this conversation and a lot of the conversations that are going on out there. There were two things that came up: equitable access. I mean, for all intents and purposes, if the cost of education is the barrier, then we have to find out ways to address the cost of education as a barrier. And I believe that it is in many cases. And so equitable access, if education were free, what impact do you think that would have on the diversity of the applicant pool?
You see, I find it funny that you went straight there. And for the sake of the audience, I think it's important that we talk about what you meant by education being free. Were you talking about K through 12, or were you talking about professional education?
I'm talking about
or higher ed in general.
I'm talking about veterinary medicine. I'm talking about equitable access for individuals interested in a professional degree.
Okay, so when I use the word equitable access, it is not just economics.
Okay.
It is also about the quality of the education process itself.
Okay.
From birth to death.
Okay. So I was just picking a small portion of that.
I know you were. And that's what I wanted to make sure that we understood the differences in the scope of what I was talking about here.
I went to a portion of the scope thinking that that's where you were. You were talking about a more global overview.
Yes. And I also want to say that education is not free.
No.
Let's stop. That's part of the problem. Everything costs something. The question is, who is going to pay for it?
True.
Right? And I happen to believe that the greatness of America is based on the fact that America was willing to share that cost among its citizenry in a public education system. And that it was the result of that public education system that is the basis for the scientific advances that we see in America, because it provided the needed intellectual training for majority of the population. So when I talk about equitable access, I mean equitable access for all of the citizenry, whether you are in a metropolitan school system or a county school system, whether you are in the North or the South. There will always be some inequities, but those inequities should not be based on demographic concerns if we are truly a nation or a state.
So I'm glad you used the term demographic, because we're actually an interesting point in the country where we've got 5 generations of veterinarians currently working with 5 generations of clients and 5 generations of employees. And if we look at differences between individuals, there are a multitude of differences, including Gen Y, Gen Z, baby boomers, millennials, silent generation, all of whom have different demographics within the generations. We have gender differences. Obviously, we've got race, religion, and sex differences. So really, when we started this conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion, it's really one of a greater conversation on the awareness of differences and learning about those differences and assimilating them into your knowledge base so that you enter a conversation with greater knowledge and a greater ability to understand the individuals with whom you are working or speaking. So I think the awareness of differences is really probably the more important component of this conversation. And I think the focus on diversity, equity, inclusion is all about awareness and the awareness of differences, but also, and probably more importantly, the awareness of similarities.
Yes, I have nothing to add to that. I think, without confusing it.
Wait, then that's a good place to stop.
Yeah. I think that if I could put a finer point on it, though, it is that it's not just the differences in individuals that we should be aware of. We should also be aware of the differences in circumstances and what led up to those circumstances. The sitcoms of the wild, the westerns and the small town shows tended to promote a view of a patriarchal hero that understood the privileged versus the non-privileged, and was able to see beyond the clothing, to see the worth of an individual beyond the value of the clothing they happen to wear, and understood the potential of all those individuals. There was a time in the United States when it was commonly thought that doctors came from the aristocratic society, part of society. World War II forced the army to conscript soldiers from all parts of the socioeconomic spectrum to be medics. And they performed admirably in the field and suddenly realized, I can do this. The 100 Black Men has a saying, what they see is what they'll be. When it was seen and accepted that people from all walks of life had the spectrum of intellect that included those good enough to become doctors. After the war, we passed the GI Bill. And many of those who were medics decided to become doctors that never would have done it before. And that provided improved health care throughout the United States because they went back home. They weren't waiting for an aristocrat to graduate and then locate in an area that didn't have it before. This is what diversity does in advancing society. But there is an emotional aspect that we must deal with. We must deal with the anger of those who have been insulted. And we must deal with, and now, and I'm loath to say this, but after years of maybe a slightly misguided attempt to achieve that diversity, we have guilt-ridden descendants who are tired of being guilty and are now angry at going through decades of feeling as if they couldn't speak, of being accused of racist actions before they had a chance to even do them. Now, some of them did them. Some of them felt them. But now, instead of coping with these sets of anger, we're focusing on words. We're fighting about the word diversity. We're fighting about the reaction to diversity or the reaction to slavery instead of involving everybody in a consensual approach to solving a problem that was caused by our ancestors.
Okay, hold that thought. I want to wrap part one of this conversation. I don't think we're done, but we need to take a break. We'll be back with part two. As we wrap up, I just want to thank Nationwide and Nicole. We will continue on this thread in 2 weeks whenever you listen to it. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.